Welcome to Aldsidu. This is our channel with the Aldsidu website at www.aldsidu.com. We are a group of Old Ways Heathens. Aldsidu stands for Old Customs or Old Ways. And there is a divide in modern heathenry. There's a minority that does old gods and old ways, and there's a majority that does old gods and new ways. Both sides are totally right in what they do, but those of us who want to do old ways, we do a lot of research. So at Aldsidu, we're trying to not just for the old Saxon heathens, but for all Germanic heathens, which includes the Scandinavian heathens, we're trying to teach historical heathenry based on sound research and quoting of the Eddas, the sagas, historical sources to prove what the old ways and old traditions were. Asatru was born in the United States after it was born in Iceland. The founder in the United States left Wicca and formed something called the Viking Brotherhood in 1974. And while this was a tremendous event, bringing Norse gods back to life in the States, lots of Wicca was brought into Asatru from that. So the Wiccan wheel of the year is the Wiccan calendar. It is 100% solar. It has 4 and 8 solar points of the year, 2 solstices, 2 equinoxes, and then halfway points in between solstices and equinoxes. It ignores the moon completely, which always amazes me because, I know some Wiccans well, and they talk about full moons as well, but the Wiccan wheel is 100% solar. So this video is really about the dating of the Germanic holy days. And I'm going to quote the world's foremost scholar, Dr. Andreas Nordberg, who's the most renowned scholar on the dating of Germanic heathen holy days. He basically states that anyone who's trying to put Yule on the solstice is more interested in the solstice itself than they are in the sources for Norse religion. Dr. Nordberg has put his book up online for free on academia.edu. I would look it up. There is a 1-page English intro and a 20-page English summary of his book, which is in Swedish. Hence, you can see the Swedish title. But it is the most comprehensive and most archaeologically intense dating of Yule using the archaeological evidence as well as the literary sources, from runic staffs, rune stave calendars to calendar rods that have been left behind, as well as the literary sources that state the lunar solar, which means the calendar was lunar first, the lunar reckoning of the dating of Germanic heathen holy days. We have 3 historical heathen calendars that survived, and the first one has been studied a lot by one subgroup of heathenry, Bede's De Temporum Rationae, which was written in the exact year 725 AD. That is not a circa. It was written in 725 AD. Einhard's Vita Carolini Magni was written around 830 AD. Vita Carolini Magni stands for Life of Charles the Great. Charles the Great is also known as Charlemagne. He's the most brutal oppressor of heathenry ever to walk the earth. He really brutally oppressed heathenry with a 33-year war to force the Saxons in Saxony and the heathens in Frisia and many heathen tribes to leave their native ancestral faith and to take a foreign faith of Christianity. The Iceland Althing recorded the calendar in the 10th century. It is a Christianized calendar, though. It did use 12 moon names of the heathen pre-Christian calendar, but the Iceland Althing recorded it because by 960 AD, most of Iceland was Christian already, and they decided to abandon their heathen lunar calendar and switch to a solar calendar. And they didn't just follow Rome right away. They had 12 30-day fixed months. And then they had a leap week in the summer, which is interesting in itself. So they wanted to ditch their heathen calendar, but they didn't want to borrow the calendar of the Romans quite yet, despite the fact that the Christian world was using that Christian calendar. We have many individual saga passages and other historical passages discussing the dating of 3 major bloats a year. Before I address that, we do have Alphablot and Disting. Disting is not a bloat, but these are recorded in Swedish sources. But all the Germanic tribes in Northern Europe who venerated the Aesir did celebrate dates to begin summer, to begin winter, and midwinter. Those are the 3 major bloats. The Ynglinga Saga, chapter 8 in 1225 AD. This is one of the many passages that give us hints as to when the Norse holy days were in pre-Christian days. So on winter day, the first day of winter, there would be a bloat for a good year. So the first day of winter, or winter nights, is a bloat for a good year, which is the sign that winter nights is the new year. Also, the middle of winter, there's a bloat for a good crop. So Yule is actually, at least according to this passage, is a bloat for a good crop. And the third major bloat of the year was on the first day of summer. It was called Victory Bloat. Sigrblot is your Icelandic or Germanic word that means a bloat or a sacrifice for victory. There is a famous passage that people associate with disting incorrectly. And with disting coming up, I see on a number of websites, especially Wikipedia, taking this passage, not this one here on Sigrblot, but another passage that I'm going to get to shortly. And it says it's a victory bloat there as well, and it confuses that with disting. But disting is one full moon before Sigrblot, or victory bloat. And disting and Disablot are 2 different things. So for those of you going to do disting on the 3rd full moon of the year, do not confuse that with victory bloat. So the 3 major bloats a year, we have winter nights, which is also called Haustblot, and which is also called Disablot. There are some very minor differences between all the Germanic tribes. They all venerated the Aesir. But there are very minor differences between them. Like the Icelanders and the Norwegians are very similar. Most of the people who moved to Iceland were Norwegians. The Danes and the Swedes are very, very similar. Not that all 4 of these Scandinavian peoples aren't similar, but there is a more closeness with the Danes and Swedes than there is with the Norwegians and the Icelanders. For example, only the Danes and the Swedes have a 9-year sacrifice. Every 9 years. So Thietmar of Merseburg claims that the Danes did a 9-year sacrifice. They sacrificed 98 animals. And Adam of Bremen says the Swedes did a 9-year sacrifice at Uppsala. So, you know, the Swedes and the Danes are geographically closer together, so naturally they're a little more alike than the Norwegians and the Icelanders. So since I just quoted a Swedish saga, Ynglinga Saga, let's look at Iceland for winter nights. Ynglinga Saga, chapter 6. At the start of winter, a symbol was prepared and a Disablot, in which observants all were expected to take part. But Glum sat in his place and did not attend. So in Iceland, winter nights is also called Disablot. Winter nights is the start of winter. In Norway, we see something interesting as well. Gisa Saga Sursanar, chapter 9. Thorgrim meant to have a Haustblot on Veternotum, and to sacrifice to Frey. So, in Norway, winter nights, Veternotum, is the word for winter nights, is also called the Haustblot. And winter nights is on the full moon of Haustmanuther, which means harvest moon. So we have a moon called Haustmanuther, which is the winter nights occurs on the full moon of it. 3 full moons later is Yolmanuther, which means Yule moon. How many heathen organizations teach that there is a moon called Yule? And there's actually 2 moons of the year called Yule. I'll get to that shortly. Speaking of 2 moons, the first person to record 2 Yule moons was the Old English or Old Anglish Bede, who wrote in De Temporum Rationae. Thus, the moon by which they began their winter season was called Winterfilleth, a name compounded of the terms for winter and full moon. Because from the full moon of that moon, or month, winter was thought to begin. So we have written evidence, not just the archaeological evidence with the calendar staffs and the runic staffs, the runic calendar staffs, and the calendar rods. We have evidence that the winter nights, the first major bloat of the year, literary evidence and archaeological evidence. Now, 3 full moons after Haustmanuther or winter nights, which was a Disablot, we have a full moon most years in January, some years in early February, called Yule, which is midwinter. So Thietmar of Merseburg, around 1000 AD, when he was writing of the Danes, and this is where he wrote of the 9-year sacrifice. So this is an important passage. You know, everyone thinks of the Adam of Bremen only with the 9-year sacrifice, but Thietmar of Merseburg mentions it with the Danes. And he says that as I have heard stories concerning their ancient midwinter sacrifices or bloats, I will not allow this custom to be ignored. In the middle of that kingdom, it is called Letteren, or Lera. And in the region of Helland, all people gathered every 9 years in January. That is, after we have celebrated the birth of our Lord. And then they offered to their gods sacrifices. Now you have to remember that at this point in history, December 21st was Christmas. I mean, you know, their calendar was the Julian calendar, and the solstice on the Julian calendar was December 25th. In the year 1582, in October, they skipped from October 4th to October 15th because the Julian calendar was about a day off every 100 years. So the Julian calendar, you know, the Germanic peoples probably knew when the solstice was better than the Romans. So, you know, in 1582, they had to skip 11 days and move the solstice 4 days backwards, which is like skipping 15 days. So it tells you that the Julian calendar was that far wrong, and hence Christmas remained on December 25th. It was originally put there by Roman pagans due to Saturnalia. But once the church became the Orthodox Church, starting from the 4th century onwards, they made no compromises with paganism. So we have December 25th was on the solstice. But yet Thietmar of Merseburg says Yule was after the birth of the Lord. So back to Andreas Nordberg, Dr. Andreas Nordberg in his book. He's very clear from the literary and the archaeological evidence that the pre-Christian Yule feast occurs at the first full moon after the first new moon following the winter solstice, while the disting took place on the third full moon according to the same method of calculation. So, this is contrary to what a lot of people have taught in modern heathenry, that Christmas is on the solstice. Well, Christmas, I guess, is on the solstice, but Yule, is not on the solstice. At least it was not historically. Heathens used a Lunisolar calendar, which means they used the sun to determine when a 13th moon would be added to the year. Our modern word month comes from the word moon. Month and moon are related. A month is a lunar cycle. However, nowadays, like our modern September, has nothing to do with the lunar cycle at all. The insanity of the Roman calendar is taken over, and unfortunately, our heathen calendar will probably never be reborn. Outside of the fact that most of us in Aldsidu use it as our spiritual calendar. We've restored it for our spiritual. You know, Jews and Judaism do the same thing. They have their spiritual calendar and they follow the calendar of the rest of the world in their secular life. We in Aldsidu, we do the same thing. The Old English moons of Yuli, that G is pronounced like a Y, Yuli. There were 2 Old English moons of Yuli. The first and the last moon of the year were called Yuli, or Yule. And there were 2 moons in the Swedish calendar and Norwegian calendar and Icelandic calendar, Jolmanuther. There were 2 Yule moons in the pre-Christian heathen calendar as well. Dr. Nordberg also states on page 147 of his book, he states Icelandic sources from the 13th century mention 2 months called Jular or Jolmanuther. Now, because we used Latin letters, or monks did, Y's in Latin are U's. So, that Y, don't be confused. Even the name Tyr for the god, Tyr, is really Tur. I'm probably not pronouncing it right. I am an American, but, these Ys are really ooh sounds. So, Uller is Icelandic, Jolmanuther is more the Scandinavian continent outside of Iceland. And this does match Bede in De Temporum Rationae, who in the early 8th century mentioned 2 Yule moons on the Old English calendar. And Nordberg also states that the runic evidence, the runic calendars, the calendar staffs, they divide the year into 4 quarters. There's 2 seasons. There's winter and then there's summer. And there's midwinter and midsummer. So 3 full moons divided the Norse year into 2 seasons, but 4 quarters. And I should state that there is evidence in the folk tales, the sagas, the provincial laws, rune staves, calendar rods. Nordberg, that's a quote from Nordberg, and he's right. The archaeological evidence is pretty strong. Chapter 15 of Saga of Hakon the Good is the true story. I'm sure it's fictionalized slightly, but King Hakon the Good was the son of the first king of all Norway, Harald Fairhair. And Hakon the Good's brother was older, so he was first in line, and he was king first. But with the death of his brother Eric, King Hakon came from England, where he became a Christian, and he came back to Norway, and he decided that heathenry sucked, and he was going to make the country Christian. Today, Scandinavian countries call Christmas Yule. They do it thanks to this Hakon the Bad, as I like to call him, not Hakon the Good. Hakon the Good decided to by force move Yule from the full moon of Yule moon to be on the same day as Christmas, which is the solstice. And this story is documented in chapter 15 of the Saga of Hakon the Good. So it states clearly that he made a law that the festival of Yule should begin at the same time as the Christian people held it, which is December 25th, which was the solstice. And every man under penalty, etc., they're going to celebrate, but I want to skip. But before Hakon the Good, formally the first night of Yule was Holkenot. That is midwinter night, and Yule was held for 3 nights. So in heathen times, according to the sagas, Yule was not 12 nights that began on the solstice. No, it was 3 nights. And winter nights is also attested in the sagas as being 3 nights. We have 3 bloats and we have 3 nights. 3, 3, and 3. 9 is a very holy number. To use a Christian word, a sacred number. Well, Heilige is actually a heathen word, but it's a sacred number. So, believe it or not, it's actually Christian to celebrate Yule on the solstice because, before Wicca was born in the 1950s or 60s, this was Christianization. Forced Christianization moved Yule to the solstice at the same time as Christmas. And we in Aldsidu, we believe that Christmas and Yule are 2 different holy days that celebrate 2 different things from 2 different religions. So we don't feel it's a good idea to follow Christianity in Christianizing Yule. So we're going to keep Yule where Yule was, and we're going to remain heathen and following the old ways. Thank you. People don't like me saying these things, but, the trees and the grass and the birds seem to have 2 seasons. Nature has 2 seasons. The grass is brown half the year and doesn't grow, and it's green half the year and it grows. Trees have leaves half the year, they don't have leaves half the year. And the birds migrate in the 2 different halves of the year. And most of this goes on. People want to say, hey, it happens around the time of the equinox, but those who live north of Chicago know that trees don't lose their leaves until after the autumn equinox, and they're not growing leaves until after the vernal equinox. So the fact that the heathens were lunar solar actually follows nature more. So, and I also like to say, there's 3 major bloats a year, but Asatru has a Christmas and Easter. It's called Solstice Yule and Equinox Ostara. Winter Nights is actually attested in the lore more than Yule and more than Sigerblot. And yet, only at Christmas time and Easter time are we seeing a bunch of Happy Holy Days posts from a bunch of people on Facebook, it seems. So we at Aldsidu are trying to change that. Winter Nights is a major holy day, and it's almost completely forgotten. And Solstice Yule and Equinox Ostar seem to be remembered because it's in line with what people did before they became heathen. They're still practicing some of their Christian thoughts. But getting out of the Christian mindset back to the pre-Christian heathen mindset, we have a bloat on the first full moon of winter, Wintermanuth, or Haustmanuther to the Scandinavians. On the full moon of Haustmanuther, we have winter nights, and 3 full moons after winter nights would be Yule or midwinter, and there's a bloat. And 3 full moons after winter full moon would begin the Saxon summer. So, how do we get midwinter? Well, when you have a lunar year, there's 3 full moon quarters. There's 6 full moons making up winter, 6 full moons making up summer. Leap years, they would add a full moon to the summer. And keep in mind, when summer is not attested by Bede as a Letha holy day, he just mentions it as a moon name, Letha. And we only have one reference to a midsummer bloat in the entirety of the 700 sagas and Norse poems. And that bloat is a reaction in Trondheim, an anti-Christian forced conversion reaction. Tacitus in Germania in 98 AD made very clear that the Germanic tribes kept a lunar calendar. And the Old Saxon Helland, I'll leave this passage here. It states very clearly that Word and the Shapers, Urther and the Nornir in Norse mythology, these times were set. Middle yard followed the waning and the waxing of the moon. Days of the week is definitely a Christian thing. It started Semitic in Persia and the Middle East. The belief that there was an all-powerful God that created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Heathens did not believe that. They did not believe in a 7-day period of time. And a lunar cycle is 29 and a half days, so it goes from 29 days to 30 days. There were days of the moon, and you can see the moon in the sky. There's no arguing that, the crescent switch sides or the moon is full. It's in full view for everyone to see. The Romans obviously messed up the Julian calendar. They got off like 15 days, as I mentioned earlier. The Julian calendar had to be corrected by the Gregorian calendar. The solstices were hard for some people to pinpoint. I think the Germanic tribes probably did it better than the Romans. We have evidence in other sagas, like let's move on to Sigerblot, Victory Blot. In Heimskringla, Olaf Saga Helga 77, in Sweden there was an age-old custom while they were still heathen that there would be a bloat in the moon of Goa. Now it actually says just during Goa. Moon I put in parentheses because it's not in the Icelandic, but it's like saying in the month of February. You guys know what February is, but by the way, Goa is not in February. It is in the modern Icelandic calendar, but in the pre-Christian heathen calendar, Goa was in April. So then they would bloat for peace and victory for their king, and people from all over Sweden would resort there. Bloats for victory means Sigerblot. So Wikipedia and lots of Asatru orgs seem to get this messed up with Disting. Disting is not a bloat. Disting is a Disa thing, from Disir and thing. There was a thing once a year, and sure there was religious significance to that, but a bloat and a thing are two different things, and Disablot is the start of winter or winter nights. So, the Icelandic calendar, the modern Icelandic calendar, they ditched the historical lunar calendar. In the 10th century, they decided that they were going to become more like Rome, but they didn't like Rome's calendar, so they set 12 months of 30 fixed days with a leap week in the middle of summer that was even outside of the 12 months, which is how they got to an average of 365.22 days. And it's kind of weird. There's an ein maneuver and a twi maneuver. Ein meaning one and two meaning second. the 6th and the 11th month, that they have one moon and second moon titles, which doesn't even make sense. The Icelandic calendar didn't make a lot of sense, but they wanted to keep some of their heritage while adopting a solar calendar and to get it more aligned with the Christians who they were now doing business with. And just a reminder, Ynglinga Saga 8 calls the bloat to begin summer victory bloat. So the bloat up here when they're doing a bloat for victory of the king and Olaf's Saga Helga 77. Um, I don't know why Wikipedia and one major Asatru org in particular want to call this a Disablot with this thing. Completely incorrect, and a misunderstanding of the Christianization of the Icelandic calendar and the movement of the lunar months. The modern Icelandic calendar, by the way, does have only one Yule moon, and it ends on December 14th, before the solstice and before Heathen Yule. So the modern Icelandic calendar is something that was Christianized. Dr. Nordberg, in his book is in Swedish, but there's a 1-page English intro and a 20-page English summary. So I've quoted a passage right here, quoting Nordberg in English. But this is from the Swedish part of his book, saying when the earliest part of Yule can begin. And the English says very clearly, in the times of the Old Norse Yule and the great sacrifice at Lyra, according to Thietmar of Merseburg, dates given in the Julian calendar. In the Julian calendar of the 10th century, the full moon of the second Yule moon month could occur on the 31st of December at the earliest and on the 29th of January at the latest. So that means it's even later with the Gregorian calendar. But Thietmar stated the great sacrifice in Lyra took place in the month of January, approximately the same time as the full moon of the second Yule moon. This suggests that the two sacrifices were in fact one and the same. So in other words, he's saying the midwinter is definitely Yule, but I think just about everyone agrees with that. So in summary, we do have Disting and Alphablot attested in historical sources, but they're not the three major bloats of the year. Disting occurs one full moon before Sigurblot, and it occurs in Sweden only. Alphablot is only attested in Sweden as well. It's only attested in a Swedish poem. You can visit all my blogs at www.aldsidu.com/blog. I have about 80 different blogs quoting historical sources left and right. I did want to mention a few words that Ostara is a Wiccan Sabbat name. Ostara is not mentioned in the Eddas or the Sagas. Oster is a Old English and Frisian and Frankish goddess. Dr. Philip A. Shaw wrote a book called Oster, Retta, and the Cult of the Matrons. One of the biggest holy days of the Matrone cult was Mother's Night, which is a different night from Yule. The Cult of the Matrone in Roman Rhineland, a historical evaluation of the archaeological evidence by Alex G. Garman. Very important to know about Oster and the Matrone cult. There was about 150 to 200 Ostria Hene stones that are found in southern England and northern Francia. We have two literary historical mentions of Easter, once by Bede in De Temporum Rationae 15, and we have once in Vita Carolini Magni, chapter 29, which lists the Old Frankish calendar. So Oster is how it's said in Old Frankish. I believe this is also pronounced Oster. I've heard people pronounce it Astra. I'm an Old Saxon expert, not Old English expert, so I leave it to those who are more versed in that. But Oster is definitely confined to southern England and northern Francia and Frisia, and that's where the literary and archaeological evidence is on her. And in the Old Saxon language, the Saxons in Saxony, they use only Pascha in all of the Old Saxon writings describing the Christian celebration that was originally known as Passover, that became known as Easter much, much, much later, long after Heathenry was gone and long after Bede wrote. And lastly, I want to discuss, a lot of people think I'm attacking Asatru's orthodoxy, or I'm teaching my orthodoxy. Well, I am questioning Asatru's orthodoxy for sure. People tend to get mad because Asatru does have established orthopraxy is really a better term for it. That the solstices and the equinoxes in their mind are Asatru holy days, whether the historical evidence says so or not. So we're trying to look at old historical ways based on evidence. So we do have a difference of opinion here. But thank you for listening. I tried to keep this at 20 minutes and I failed. I'm at half an hour again. But thanks for watching and I look forward to your comments.